Welcome back to TechNet Radio. In this episode, we welcome Bill Baer and Microsoft Certified Master and SharePoint Ranger, Brian Porter, as they discuss claims-based identity in SharePoint 2010. Listen in as they chat about its benefits, implications, and how-to tips that can help drive greater interoperability with SharePoint and other systems. Bill, the mic is yours.
Hello and welcome to the second episode of SharePoint 2010 for the IT professional on TechNet Radio. Again, I'm your host, Bill Baer, a technical product manager here in the SharePoint product group in Redmond, Washington. And joining me again is Brian Porter, SharePoint MCM and SharePoint Ranger. Today's discussion is going to be claims-based identity in SharePoint 2010. And the reason we're choosing to discuss claims-based identity is, one, we want to illustrate that SharePoint is a flexible platform that can really plug in seamlessly to your existing applications and to your existing environment, whether those are Microsoft-based applications or third-party applications. So Brian, claims-based identity has been all the buzz with SharePoint 2010 today. Can you briefly explain the benefits and perhaps what type of problems it can help to solve?
Sure. Well, claims-based authentication and claims-based identity really bring to the table a provider-agnostic level of indirection over the authentication and authorization mechanisms that you can use within your environment. And that's a whole lot of babble, but what I mean there is it really is it's a standard that allows you to separate the mechanism of authentication from the means of authorization. What that brings to the table is that enables just huge interoperability scenarios with non-Microsoft, non-Active Directory authentication sources. So the example that I always give is, in a traditional SharePoint environment, leveraging Windows authentication, for instance, you come, IIS authenticates you, and then you are allowed into the system, and we will authorize your subsequent requests. With claims-based authentication, claims-based identity, you come to SharePoint, and SharePoint says, I'm going to send you, in an identity federation scenario, I'm going to send you to someone else and that I trust, and they're going to authenticate you, and then I'm going to authorize you based on the token that user sends back the next time you come talk to me. And the ability to establish authorization principles based on claims that you trust issued by that third party, that really enables that really basically it breaks the dependency between SharePoint and Active Directory and really enables some really interesting partner federation scenarios. Even internally, I've seen organizations start working through those types of federation scenarios internally. So it's a huge thing it brings to the table.
Cool. So can you describe kind of a common claims-based scenario that you see a lot of people implementing or thinking about implementing today?
Sure. So, I can describe what is basically the canonical scenario, and that is I am an organization. I have an extranet-facing secured portal, and I want to enable partners to access that portal, but I do not want those partners, I don't have to manage those partner accounts. In 2007, you could do this, and there was a variety of ways that you could do it, but they all basically required that you maintain a user store. We did have some guidance published on how you could leverage the first version of ADFS to enable, turn SharePoint basically into a claims-aware app. But it was very much an after-the-fact type thing. When you set it up, when you went through that process, it felt like this is not a technology that was baked into the platform.
Right.
So commonly in 2007, you would see people stand up either forms-based authentication using a SQL Server store or an Active Directory LDAP store like ADLDS or an Atom instance, or you would see them stand up an entirely separate Active Directory environment that they would place their partner accounts in, and then their partners would access the portal. They authenticate against that local store. In any instance, it was sort of a messy proposition because what you were doing is you were still in charge of the partner's accounts. So if the partner wanted to access your extranet portal, they had to call you and you'd provision them an account. Really, what we can do now with claims-based authentication and sort of what I call the canonical use case is we can, with ADFS or with any SAML-compliant security token service, the partner can stand that up. They can give you a couple certificates. They can give you a few URLs that you need to redirect to. Your SharePoint environment can say, I'm going to trust the users that are authenticated by my partner's system, and then that allows you to kind of delegate account creation, and even in some instances, rights assignment to that partner. They manage their accounts that they're giving to their employees. But you can successfully authenticate those users, or excuse me, not authenticate, you can successfully authorize those users, and you can integrate them into your processes inside your version of the platform. You've delegated the authentication aspect of your extranet portal to that third party.
So that's definitely an interesting scenario. So as I think about it, one of the big things that you mentioned was SAML. So it sounds like what happens from a SharePoint perspective is we go through some kind of normalization process where we take the user that's coming into the system and we take that SAML token that they were issued, and then inside of SharePoint, that's what we create our SP user object out of, and then we do all kinds of authorization and augmentation and a bunch of cool stuff with. But when you mention SAML, one of the things that comes immediately into my head, at least, is that you can pack a bunch of stuff into a SAML token, which means I can say, you are Brian Porter with blonde hair, you are not the Brian Porter with brown hair, and now I can do something with your blonde hair, like show you hair care products for blonde-haired people. It sounds like you can do some interesting kind of role-based authorization things with claims-based authentication in SharePoint.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the sort of the neatest scenarios that I've seen people do is with when they'll perform claims augmentation, and then they'll actually authorize and secure content off of the augmented claim. So one of the things that we allow you to do inside of our product, inside of SharePoint, we have a story in ADFS here. So in SharePoint, you can write a custom claims provider. It's a very simple piece of code, very simple interface. We've got some end-to-end walkthroughs up on MSDN that walk you through this process. And in these custom little pieces of code, you can perform claims augmentation. So you can dynamically issue claims to the inbound user. So you said, I'm Brian Porter, and maybe I come in, my SAML token says, I'm Brian Porter, and I have blonde hair, right? Or I have brown hair. And actually, I don't have any hair, so that's sort of a joke. I can have a claims provider perform claims augmentation, and based on some property of me, some attribute that it knows about me, about who I am, it can dynamically issue other claims there, right? So it can say, oh yes, he also lives in St. Louis, Missouri, and he's 6'1", right? Those are dynamically generated claims that it can inject into that token that then downstream inside of SharePoint I can then secure content on. So I can do things like users can't look at this particular web page unless they have brown hair and live in St. Louis, Missouri, or unless they're bald and live in St. Louis, Missouri, as would be the case for me to get in. And then, of course, we've got there's a couple different ways you can do this, right? So again, we're standards-based now, so we interoperate with any STS out there that can generate a SAML token and understands WS Federation, we can deal with. So like one of the things that you'll see all over TechNet in terms of documentation on how to do this walkthroughs is setting up these types of scenarios with our ADFS product. And you can do this with ADFS too. So ADFS supports this thing called custom attribute stores that allows you to do a really similar thing. It's essentially inject logic into the claims augmentation and issuance process so that you can do these interesting things. And then once you get the token back inside of SharePoint, you can do the things that you're talking about. You can say you have to have these random properties, not just you have to be a member of this group. It's much more expressive than that.
Cool. So one of the things that I've heard IT professionals describe about claims-based authentication is kind of twofold. One, they say claims is a necessary evil. And the reason they say that is because they were dictated the use of claims within the deployment by an IT manager or somebody in the organization that has the power to dictate what the deployment's going to look like, or they heard about claims-based authentication. So IT professionals immediately say it's a necessary evil, or one of the things that they say is, I've heard configuring SharePoint 2010 for claims is utterly complex. What are your opinions on kind of those statements? Is it as complex as one may make it sound, or is there a reduced level of complexity and there's actually easy ways to do it?
So probably the biggest thing about claims auth is that it's different, and it's not just a little bit different. It's way different from the authentication story that most IT organizations are used to. It's not particularly hard, and it's actually not particularly complicated. It just works differently, and it works differently because it's trying to achieve goals that authentication standards in the past have never tried to achieve, and that is, sort of this platform agnostic, implementation agnostic, provider agnostic ability to authenticate across systems and servers and OS platforms, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that trip people up is they say, okay, I want to go and I want to set up claims auth for Windows users, and they go through and they're able to do that real quickly through the central administration user interface in SharePoint 2010. And they're like, oh, that's awesome. Now I'm doing claims auth. I can play around with this a little bit. I can see the claims coming through. I'm still doing Windows auth, so the experience didn't change all that drastically. It's when they go to implement the more advanced scenarios, those partner federation scenarios, that's when people start getting a little confused because they don't see any buttons in the user interface for how to configure that. Those are the types of scenarios that you can only really configure at the command line. And again, it's not complicated. You just got to spend a little time reading up on some PowerShell commandlets to get it configured, and we've got some great walkthroughs out there that will walk you through step by step everything that you need to do in order to get it working. But I think it's sort of to be expected, right? Those are some fairly advanced scenarios, and it requires a little bit more work getting configured. Now, claims auth and managing a claims auth enabled site versus managing a classic mode or Windows auth enabled site, is managing a claims auth site more difficult? I would say no. I really don't think that there's no real differences in managing that claims enabled web application. In fact, if anything, it becomes a little easier because you gain additional abilities for securing the content in there. And once you get over that initial setup hump, which really is not that big of a hump. It's a little bit of understanding how authentication flows in claims-based authentication scenarios, and you can get there pretty quick. Once you get over that, once you get that configured, it's really not a big deal, and it just brings so much to the table in terms of expressiveness.
Great. So one last question for you, really. Is the process for migrating from 2007, whether you're using forms-based authentication or you're using integrated Windows, which could be NTLM or Kerberos, is it challenging to migrate from those scenarios to 2010 with claims-based authentication?
So there's certainly some things to think about. One of the things that you have to take into account when you're doing any sort of migration is downtime and availability of the content during the migration. And there are some very specific steps that you have to take when you're moving the claims-based auth from, say, an FBA environment in 2007, or even just a standard Windows auth environment in 2007. Is it challenging? I wouldn't say that it's challenging. It's definitely something that you want to do in a test environment first. It's definitely something that you want to understand the peculiarities of your environment before you go and kind of pull the trigger in your production infrastructure. But I don't know that it's particularly challenging. And again, we've got, from a documentation perspective, we have just explicit walkthroughs and guidance on exactly what has to happen and in what order when you're doing these types of operations. The biggest variable, honestly, is not the steps needed to enable claims-based authentication when you're migrating content from 2007, but it's actually the content migration from 2007. The biggest challenge in enabling these types of things is things like how big are the content databases that I'm bringing over? How is that going to impact my migration timelines? How am I going to maintain availability of these sites during the migration? But the actual switch to claims-based auth, again, a little bit of documentation to read, and it's something that generally goes fairly smoothly.
Great. So that's all the time we have today for today's session. Brian, you've given us a lot of great information over the last 2 episodes we've done. Is there a blog or a Twitter handle we can follow you at?
Yes, you can always visit my blog at www.brianporter.com. It's Brian with a Y. Or on Twitter at BetaPorter is my Twitter handle.
Great. So again, I just wanted to thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to more episodes from you.
Great. Thanks for having me.